Investigations the NTSB accepts are potentially critical for aviation safety, both domestically and internationally. The industry cannot afford to have repeated failures of causes that drop airplanes, goods, and people from the skies without the root causes of those problems being fixed thereafter. All of us need the NTSB to do its job faithfully and free from corruption to assure public safety. The results of an NTSB investigation are generally as unquestioned and as final as a jury's verdict in a court trial. Rarely is there a word left to be said once the NTSB has come to its considered conclusion, as rarely can an investigation from any other source be as thorough as a government-funded many-man-year effort by the NTSB. The evidence and narrative for this event fills 415 double-columned pages. There's no hope to be able to cover it all in one segment. We'll just cover the subset that I hope will be dear to all aviation hearts, that is, the NTSB investigation. The NTSB's investigators are the cream of the aviation industry crop. Who in aviation wouldn't consider it prestigious to work for the NTSB? This story is bigger than almost every other because it embodies multi-agency, interagency corruption and criminality, involves the FAA, NTSB, Hawaii state and county governments, and incredibly, the military, namely the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard. There's lots of evidence, and it all adds up to proof. The compressor turbine disc at left suffered the breakage of multiple fan blades, which then impacted the shroud, that is, their housing, at right, taking out other fan blades and causing an intense fire. When such an engine failure occurs in flight, the public reasonably and absolutely relies on the NTSB to get to the bottom of such a failure, including all relevant details. In this case, the NTSB took 2.5 calendar years to complete the investigation. There have certainly been other turbine fan blade failures, even for this same engine. A Mokulele Cessna Grand Caravan, the same type involved in the Makanikai Air crash that's of interest to us in this segment, happened just 2 months earlier, also in Hawaii. A turbine fan blade in the Mokulele flight failed because a small glass bead left over from maintenance set up a resonance that shook apart its nearby blade, then subsequently broke all the remaining blades. The FAA published 2 airworthiness directives within a year after the crash, costing the owners of each engine of the PT-6A 114A family $60,000 plus. The first called for more frequent inspections, and second directed that all fan blades be replaced with a single crystal blade type. The NTSB supplied a 198-page engine teardown report for the Makanikai Air crash and a 112-page report for the Mokulele crash. As complex as turbine fan blade failures can be, an engine teardown for the Makanikai crash is not even relevant. But how can that be? It's because this was not an honest investigation, as there was actually no in-flight engine failure aboard the craft that ditched. The event occurred very near to the Kalaupapa Airport, which is situated on the northwest edge of a 5-square-mile peninsula off the northern side of Molokai, an island roughly in the center of the Hawaiian island chain. The Part 135 pilot of a single-engine turboprop Cessna Grand Caravan took off with 8 paying passengers toward the northeast on runway 5 with an 18-knot wind out of the east. The pilot told the media that shortly after takeoff, there was a catastrophic engine failure and the engine stopped at the map location marked by the red X. A passenger seated in 4B, just 4 of the starboard rear exit, conveniently had 2 GoPro cameras at his seat, not in an overhead bin or in a bag at his feet, but on a camera staff in his lap and in the seat pocket immediately in front of him. He took video of the takeoff until just a couple of seconds prior to the bang, which all the passengers told the FAA they heard. Within another couple of seconds, the videographer had turned his camera back on and kept it rolling until his batteries ran out, he said. In confirmation of the pilot's representation of the engine stoppage, all the witnesses to the Maui police, in separate interviews, used the very same phrase, saying after the bang, quote, "Everything went quiet," end quote. If a Cessna Grand Caravan has a catastrophic engine failure, there will be one of 2 things to hear. 1, everything goes quiet as with complete stoppage of the engine, or 2, something like a metal bucket of swirling nuts and bolts, likely accompanied by the plane's shaking, sparks, smoke, and bad smells. With the Mokulele flight 2 months earlier, there were those sounds and happenings. There was also panic, mayhem, people phoning home, people putting on life jackets, holding hands, exchanging I love yous. In the Makanikai crash, absolutely none of that is seen or heard. The passengers don't seem the least bit perturbed. This event's audio gives us two physically impossible things to hear. One, a smoothly sounding engine throughout the descent to the water, and two, an engine that goes from 0 to 15,000 plus RPM in less than a tenth of a second. At a news conference a week after the crash, the pilot said right after the bang he heard the fire warning horn going off. The fire warning horn is made up of two alternating tones that sound like this. Despite the pilot's claim, the audio-video down to the water contains no fire warning horn sound. Curiously, there is a fire warning horn that sounds 36 seconds after the engine's normal fire has been quenched by ocean waters. The only way that could have happened is by the pilot depressing the fire detect switch next to his annunciator panel. Thus the pilot lied and tried to cover his conscience as if it were part of a plan by forcing the fire warning horn to sound long after it was possible to have been triggered by an actual fire. Why would he bother? Had he forgotten to do it during the descent? Although the feathered prop produced not a sound, one can clearly hear the engine running in high RPM. Here from an ABC News broadcast.
Those passengers don't know it yet.
We're going to hear only the audio portion at the start of the ditching video, which supposedly began just a couple of seconds after the catastrophic engine failure. Here is quiet, broken only by the videographer's rustling at his seat, followed by the stall warning horn, followed by the start of the engine sound, then the engine RPM rising, then falling. Physics does not allow a Cessna Grand Caravan engine to go from 0 to 15,000 plus RPM in less than a tenth of a second, which tells us the audio has been altered. ABC News aired the descent to the water segment where an engine RPM decrease can be heard, as if by reduction from the power lever. It will occur right after the word crash.
Plane is about to crash.
On another ABC News segment, the following was heard in the last second as the plane contacted the water. Thus we have proof that the engine was not stopped as the pilot claimed, but ran sounding normally all the way down until it contacted the water. Somehow it would appear these facts escaped the NTSB investigators' notice. If the audio had not been edited to remove the engine sound at the start, it would have clearly shown the witnesses to the Maui police to be liars. In another news segment, the passenger videographer shows himself in conflicted fashion to cover up the lie that everything went quiet, as if his name were Fred Astaire.
As the sirens and bells of the airplane was going, and it was quiet.
The pilot told the NTSB, which was then dutifully reported without critical comment in the NTSB report, that upon hearing a bang and fire warning, he verified the fuel valves were on. That's precisely opposite what the pilot's operating handbook instructs for that situation, as seen red underlined in the second white excerpt. Furthermore, as one sees underlined in red at the lower right, an engine restart should not be attempted. The pilot, however, is on record as telling the U.S. Coast Guard commander, whose report is highlighted in yellow at the bottom, that he attempted 2 restarts, but both failed. No restart procedure is seen in the pilot's movement in the video, nor does the smoothly running engine sound vary in such a way as to indicate the pilot is attempting to restart his already smoothly running engine. The NTSB report didn't bother mentioning any restart attempts. The NTSB report repeats that the pilot observed all gauges displaying 0, apparently without giving it any appropriate thought as to how that could be. 2 possibilities for all gauges displaying 0 would be if the electrical system was not working, or the master switch was off, but we know that neither of those was the case because one hears the stall warning horn intermittently on the descent to the water. Just a little thinking tells us the inner turbine temperature and the oil temperature gauges necessarily would have been non-zero, as those temperatures would have taken multiple minutes to return to a 0 indication. If the engine was stopped, the fuel flow indicator necessarily would read 0. But from the video, some 10 seconds after the claimed catastrophic engine failure, we're able to see the fuel flow indicator showing the engine using about 100 pounds per hour. How could that video evidence have escaped the NTSB's notice? Therefore, it may be inferred that since the fuel flow indicator shows a high idling flow and we hear a smoothly running engine, the percent RPM gauge was necessarily non-zero as well. In other words, the pilot's been lying about many things, and the NTSB uncritically simply repeated the pilot's false representations in their report. The pilot lied when he said his annunciator panel was nothing but red and yellow lights as the fire warning horn was going off, implying that happened as he descended to the water. It was only that way for the time he held down the two buttons to the left of the annunciator panel, the fire detect and lamp test buttons, which lights all the lamps, even the unused ones, and sounds the fire warning horn. That happened and was recorded on the video, but only long after the engine had submerged underwater. All annunciator panel lights are independent, and a fire indication would not likely cause any other light to come on. Much less would it light the entire panel. 6 of the annunciator lamps were unused, thus had absolutely no other way to come on. Many other lamps would also not reasonably have come on. The upper image on screen shows all the lights that possibly could have been on, while the lower panel shows what the pilot clearly claimed. The NTSB could have, and probably did, notice the pilot's inconsistencies every bit as well as this flight instructor did, but they didn't bother to set the record straight because they didn't think John Q. Public would take note of the corruption all these activities imply. In the NTSB report and elsewhere, the pilot claimed that he made a Mayday call, but we have the Molokai Tower recording that captures the professional pilot communications from aircraft in the Kalaupapa arrival and departure area related to Honolulu's airport. Several of those were monitoring the emergency frequency, but no one reported a Mayday call. Neither is a Mayday heard or seen in what the videographer recorded in the cabin. However, an ELT beacon activation was reported, presumably as the craft hit the water, by those very same pilots only shortly after the pilot claimed he made his Mayday call. Thus the pilot is caught in another confirmed lie, the truth about which the NTSB should have been able to figure out, but didn't, repeating instead the pilot's lie in their report. In the excerpted online article shown, the crashed Cessna Grand Caravan's airline CEO and owner apparently led a media outlet to believe the crash site was a mile offshore. The image in the article originated with the U.S. Coast Guard and was later represented to be an aerial view of the crash site. Note the NTSB conveniently parrots the idea by saying, "The aircraft appears unrecoverable." The NTSB report that came out in May of 2016 says the craft ditched in open ocean waters, which is what the photo at left would seem to indicate, but it was all a lie. Using that photo was a fraudulent attempt to show the plane was a mile out, when in fact it was not the aerial view of the crash site, but the image of a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter as the rescue drew to a close. In its report, the FAA said the Cessna Grand Caravan was thought to lie 400 to 1,000 feet deep. That's not where the craft would have sunk. Someone may have looked up how deep the ocean floor was a mile offshore on the basis of the previously claimed aerial view of the crash site, but that would only compound the error. 2 other non-thinking consequences were that both the FAA and NTSB considered the crash site inaccessible and didn't bother to send anyone to the ditching location, when the site was really likely only about 30 feet down or less, and easily visible under clear blue water. Anyone should have been able to see it with their naked eye. Some people probably did see it, but somehow that information didn't get disseminated publicly, so the craft didn't get lifted from the ocean floor for about a week. The passengers, and certainly the pilot, all would have known that the plane had ditched only about 1/8 of a mile offshore, at the location pointed to by the yellow arrow I inserted. The bottom middle image shows the plane was 13.5 Cessna Grand Caravan wingspans, that is 234 yards from shore. The farthest left aircraft image in the lower middle photo is the actual ditched plane. A week after the crash, as his company pulled up the wreckage, the salver reported the craft to have been at the same 200 to 300 yards from shore as when it first ditched. Debris was spread over merely a 100-foot portion of the ocean floor. The bathymetry map depicts average constant depths, as if the ocean floor were smooth, but the actual ocean floor off Kalaupapa's airport is quite varied at the ditching location. There are generally very shallow areas, even outcroppings of the ocean floor above water, depending on the tides, and there are also deeper submerged pools as seen on screen in darker blue. I photoshopped the Cessna Grand Caravan silhouette onto the satellite image at the approximate ditching location, just for your reference. The pilot told the FAA that the catastrophic engine failure occurred at 300 feet as he was rounding the turn for Honolulu, meaning he made a 90-degree turn from the runway heading before reaching 300 feet. The typical standard would be no turns from runway heading until the craft has cleared all obstacles by 500 feet. The pilot's admitted takeoff profile in this case was certainly not found among the commuter airline's FSDO-approved procedures manual. Where I'm from, even where it's very flat, if a commuter airline pilot did that, it would openly be called reckless and dangerous, and there likely would be certificate action or at least a hearing to consider the matter. With this Makani takeoff by its pilot, who was also director of operations, not so much. The pilot, in a written statement, changed his story to say the plane was crossing 500 feet AGL, rounding the turn for Honolulu. In either case, his admission implies that pilot was turning his craft almost immediately upon rotation. Even though the entire event was scrutinized by the NTSB, there's no critique of the pilot's takeoff profile in either the NTSB or FAA reports. We've already seen photos of where the plane ditched at the orange capital D. Flying the straight-line powerless glide from the claimed catastrophic engine failure, unknown location, implies the craft would be landing downwind, 30 knots faster into the water than was necessary if he'd alternatively turned as much as his altitude would allow into the wind. No 1,000-hour experienced pilot would land directly downwind with other options available, but nothing about this was found in the NTSB or FAA reports. The actual video shows the craft on runway heading until 500 plus feet, and then it climbs for another 28 seconds. The NTSB had no critique of how that differed from the pilot's statements. The first image is in the upper left, 18 seconds after rotation, when the craft is at about 400 foot MSL. 13 seconds later, at about 650 feet, the craft has begun its turn from the runway heading. The craft would continue its left turn to a heading of about 307. That heading has the sun directly off the left wingtip from the pilot's vantage point. So, the pilot lied about his altitude at the catastrophic engine failure at the end of the takeoff video. He was really at about 1,000 foot or more with a 15-knot tailwind as he considered whether he could make the runway. The NTSB report repeats the pilot's claim that he was unable to make the airport from the Red X. But the pilot had lied again. He should have easily been able to make a safe landing onto runway 5. Even from 500 foot at the Red X, this instructor thinks a 15-knot downwind runway 31 landing after S-turns would have been far preferable to a completely downwind ditching. Over the videographer's right shoulder in his last frame of the takeoff portion of his video, one can see the northeast tip of Molokai Cliffs, Hina Lanali Point, confirming that the Red X captures the correct spot and direction of flight on the graphic at right. But when the video camera is again rolling after the claimed catastrophic engine failure at the orange R, the aircraft is 3/4 mile from where it was at the time of the supposed catastrophic engine failure. The craft has also lost 750 plus feet, turned 60 degrees away from the airport, and reoriented its direction of travel directly into the sun. These repositionings could not have taken place a few seconds to either side of a catastrophic engine failure, as claimed by the videographer, but rather must have taken most of a minute or more. These views are what the pilot would have seen at the end of the takeoff video versus the start of the ditching portion, two completely different scenes that were certainly not 3 to 6 seconds of flying apart, as the videographer claimed. Thus, the videographer also lied. Purposely flying away from the airport, as the evidence shows he did after a catastrophic engine failure when lives ostensibly were at stake, is not the kind of mistake an 18,000-hour ATP director of his company's flight operations would make. There's no other reason to fly the pattern the way the Makani pilot did in this instance than as part of the hoax that the evidence shows this entire event to have been. Despite the last video frame prior to ditching, seen on screen, showing a 20-degree left bank with a nose-low attitude, for some reason the NTSB report writer lied. How do I dare say the writer's claim of wings level slightly nose-high couldn't have been just an honest mistake? Because the writer uses the phrase, "review of the video indicated." It was unnecessarily life-threatening to ditch the plane in anything other than a wings level, nose-high attitude. Did the 18,000-hour pilot become distracted at the very most important moment of his flying career? We may never know, but I'll bet it had a lot to do with the ocean obstructions we saw on those maps we saw a moment ago. If the plane were to hit something big sticking up from the ocean floor, the plane might have flipped over, or worse. Instead of the planes making a wings-level, billowy Universal Studios splash, contacting the water took a turn for the worse for one passenger. Her seat was closest to the left main gear's attach point, breaking her seat and throwing her face up onto the floor, where her husband quickly tended to her, but not before the water covered the back half of her head, as water quickly poured into the main cabin from front and rear. A former Green Beret, who just happened to be on board, was quoted in the media saying the plane had come to an abrupt stop. The NTSB's bathymetry map, seen earlier, depicted an area near to where the plane ditched that was only 1 meter deep. Ocean floor obstructions were also depicted there and were seen on the top-down satellite image. Note the differential window heights that show us the plane did not settle quickly with both wings down symmetrically onto the water, but that the left wingtip is some 8 or 10 feet in the air, while only the starboard wing is contacting the water. Multiple passengers appear away from the craft with large parts of their upper bodies above water. As well, 5 or more of them were not wearing life jackets. How could they have been so unconcerned about needing a life jacket as their plane ditched onto the open ocean? The plane ditched a measured 234 yards from shore. Thenceforward, there are many video frames that show passenger life jackets were not resting on or even touching the water. In other harmonized but untruthful testimony to the Maui police, those passengers also said they got separated from everyone from the time they left the plane, which was, they said, when it started to sink, as there were supposedly strong ocean currents. Compare the lower right photo after the passengers had left the area, supposedly after the plane's claimed sinking event. The plane's no deeper in the water after they left that area than when they were still around it, as seen at left. 50 minutes after the ditching, all 9 passengers are seen to be within 15 yards of one another. Somehow they were repeatedly and coincidentally all simultaneously able to get into the videographer's lens view. Thus it would become a harmonized lie from the passengers that they got separated from each other from the time the plane supposedly sank, which had caused them to leave the ditching area by their claim. At that same 50 minutes after the ditching, roughly 25 minutes after the passengers left the plane area, the plane is actually rising ever higher in the water, even higher than when the passengers were around it. Things are bubbling around the engine compartment, and a man-made object is seen at the red arrow. These are the only 2 NTSB report engine photos taken before it was crated up to be sent to the manufacturer. In the photo at right, notice that the rear of the engine is out of focus, actually double exposed. Even the man at the front of the engine has become involved in the double exposure, while nothing else in the photo has that double exposure characteristic. Such a phenomenon does not happen in real life. To explain this, one has to resort to Photoshop or like electronic photo editing software. What could be in the double exposed portion that we're kept from seeing? The image at right is also unique in another way. It's the only photograph in the NTSB report that shows the propeller blade tip paint pattern, where the photo at left coincidentally shows only the unpainted side of all 3 blades. Another NTSB image that didn't get included in the NTSB's report, but came to me via the internet, is shown on screen. It nicely shows the rear of the engine from the Makanikai crash. The arrows are pointing to various engine mount members, cables, hoses, bolts, and the like, which received special attention in the form of someone using a cutting device. There can be no doubt this engine was separated from its firewall and airframe by one or more humans wielding some kind of tool. Is it possible that whoever put the NTSB report together wouldn't want the engine to be seen in sharp detail from this angle or directly behind, as the other double-exposed photo was? The answer is yes. The NTSB report intones, the airframe was fragmented into numerous pieces, which were crushed and battered in a manner consistent with being repeatedly rolled over on a hard, uneven surface by wave action. The engine had separated from the airframe." End quote. If this were true, one could expect to see significant bending, braking, and or metal fatigue at each of the separation locations, not the straight-line saw cuts that are plainly visible in the photos. Another problem the evidence presents is that the engine cuts are not complementary to their respective attach points on the firewall. Whoever made those cuts would have had to make a second or even more cuts for each mount member, hose, and cable to account for what the photos show. Any responsible NTSB investigator that would have seen these saw-cut struts on engine or firewall, knowing that the NTSB finding was to be that the engine was found separated from its fuselage on the ocean floor, is either so incompetent as not to deserve his or her job, or is a willing accomplice to the cover-up of this fraud. The many cuts seen all over the engine and firewall tell us the NTSB has come to a purposely false conclusion about the origin of the engine's separation from the airframe. This activity was noted to have been supervised by the investigator in charge, who certainly must be considered an expert, well qualified on all matters related to his team's report. This was no mistake. This is fraud at the NTSB. Somehow I don't expect Pratt and Whitney, Canada, to be amused by any of this. Notice the underwater propeller blades from the NTSB crash video at right. One can see only 2 of the 3 blades in that photo. Notice the lowest underwater blade was bent severely rearward and has apparently contacted the port side of the nose gear strut. With a normally running engine, the propeller runs counterclockwise as viewed from the front, but the 2 blades we see in the underwater photo are further evidence the propeller was in the feathered position and not turning when the craft impacted the water. That lowest blade presumably endured the most force from the water, as the plane would soon have greatly less force and speed in its forward motion, bending the other blades less. The bend in the lowest blade clearly is toward the rear as the plane contacted the water at about 80 knots. Which of the NTSB's picture's propeller blades at left would have been that severely rearward bent blade we see in the underwater photo at right? Answer, none of them. No matter any storm's underwater forces 25 foot or more below the surface, a blade that was so severely bent could not have become unbent and be made to look as do any of the blades on the left. Between 1, the saw cuts, which 2 were non-complementary and missing their intermediate mount sections, hoses, and cables, 3, 2 propellers, each bent differently, and 4, the human activity around the plane while all the passengers were away from it, we already have very strong evidence for the 2-engine theory. With all the confirmed lying that went on, the average observer would have to impute there must have been some big reason for which all these people skewed their stories and forever trashed their reputations as honest people. But wait, there are even 2 more large bodies of confirming evidence. We have the proof positive the propeller in the NTSB photo at left was not the propeller that endured the Makani-Kai air ditching. Therefore, since the ditched propeller was not the one on the left, neither was its attached engine at left the ditched engine. Therefore, the engine sent to Pratt & Whitney, Canada concerning this incident was not the engine that actually ditched with the Cessna Grand Caravan in this crash. The propeller blade tip paint pattern from a media photo taken on the barge at the upper left was rotated, scaled, replicated, and placed 7 times in the upper row of the image on screen. Similarly, 8 underwater blades, each from different video frames, got the same treatment for comparison to the media's blade tip paint pattern. Curiously, the image taken on the barge by private media shows a wider black space between each of the 2 white stripes than is evident within the underwater video frame blades. Slight variation in the underwater video frame's blades owes to underwater focusing issues, lighting, and the lower quality of the underwater camera video in use compared to a professional media still camera. The lower row of blade tip paint comparison has taken the image of the single blade having paint found in the NTSB report as seen at lower left. When considering the lower comparison row, the black area between the 2 white stripes is relatively closer to one another. Call it a match with the underwater blades. But how can that be? Aren't the 2 above water tips paint supposed to be identical since they supposedly came from the same propeller? Don't all modern propellers have the same exact blade tip paint pattern? Yes, that's a safe bet. Notice the relatively severe gouge about 5 inches from that blade's tip on the bottom side. Call it more than half a finger's depth that's been taken out of the 8 o'clock blade when viewed from the front. One can see a heavy ship's pipe showing through from behind the notch. Remember 2 slides back we saw the unpainted side of all the blades? The relevant portion from that previous picture's same propeller blade is shown in the upper left picture, but where's the notch? Is it time to believe in magic? Did a guy with a sledgehammer walk by striking an airplane that's under NTSB investigation and no one thought it worth mentioning? Or does it have to be Photoshop? See as well the coarse image pixels of the entire blade in the foreground compared to the rest of the picture. Also, the top of the NTSB's image black area between the stripes is narrower at the top than at the bottom. The inner paint stripe on that blade is also crooked with respect to the outer edge of the blade. Notice the comparison of the media image blade tip paint pattern on top and the NTSB blade tip paint pattern. The shapes of the paint on the tip and stripe are clearly different. A promotional photo published by Mechanici Air that leased and operated the Cessna Grand Caravan in this crash included an image of the crash aircraft blade tip paint pattern from some months before the crash. It showed the very same blade tip paint pattern seen on the barge engine, but it was different from the ditched underwater engine and also different from the NTSB's paint pattern image. The barge engine was the one sent to the manufacturer for teardown, and it did have the appropriate serial number that was logged to have been mounted on that aircraft. Coincidentally, the aircraft was in the Mechanici Air owner's repair station just the day before the crash. Other images of the NTSB paint-altered blade from a similar vantage point show that the NTSB report blade image was not physically altered on board ship by someone using real paint, just the digital photo was altered. At least 2 other media-captured images show the same blade the NTSB showed, but those had a different paint pattern that coincidentally exactly matched the other barge-based blade tip paint pattern that was originally used for the underwater blade comparison. Nothing about the other 2 images gave the appearance that they had been photoshopped. Here are actual photographic images of the unique painted blade shown by the NTSB, but these were taken prior to the NTSB's alteration. Those match the other barge-based blade tip paint patterns seen from other media sources. The NTSB's image therefore has been proven to have been electronically altered, having undergone photoshopping. An NTSB report does not get photoshopped in multiple ways for a trivial reason. Chain of custody documents track every user that comes into contact with all evidence. I made a FOIA request for the chain of custody log for these pictures well over a year ago, and although such requests are required to be fulfilled by law within 20 business days, I have yet to receive an official answer to my request, though I did get an acknowledgement that I had made the request. People do not lightly risk their professional livelihoods to perpetrate criminal acts by taking risks to change facts in a large, expensive, several-man-year investigation. You'll recall Pratt & Whitney Canada's besmirched reputation and costs to that company, to say nothing of Cessna or Textron, of scores of millions of dollars. The NTSB investigator in charge for this crash on the phone told me this was obviously a complex investigation. Imagine all that unnecessary Pratt & Whitney Canada teardown time for an engine that wasn't even at the crash site. All NTSB final reports are disseminated to and have been adopted by its board members before being made public. For the NTSB to let its own reputation be soiled in this fashion is an incalculable loss. Someone at the NTSB helped to craft the scenario falsely by placing the text at right into its report, even though the video shows the passenger that was said to have later passed away was actually, or at least originally, wearing an adult life jacket that had both its CO2 cartridges expended and was fully inflated. I believe the NTSB's false features were generated after the fact to account for the purported fatality to appear to have been in distress by having to wear a tight, infant life jacket that was only half inflated. A false autopsy report was later concocted to show she suffered an acute cardiac arrhythmia due to hyperventilation, for which Pratt & Whitney Canada was twice sued, once by the ostensible fatality's family and again by the claimed fatality's assistant, who apparently was made to suffer by holding the claimed fatality's hand and having to watch her die. None of the features of stress, hyperventilation, or arrhythmia could possibly have been visible at autopsy. In an extremely unusual turn of events, the medical examiner used the testimony of other passengers on the flight, as relayed from the NTSB, including the claimed but false representation that the fatality wore only a partially inflated infant life jacket to determine the cause of death. While the NTSB report parroted the pilot, passengers, and others' representation about how horrible the 6 to 8 foot waves were, the video shows an entirely different conclusion would have been the correct one. Passengers were together in one group within 15 yards of one another for over 50 minutes. Thus, the quote from Passenger R on screen is clearly an attempt to hijack the narrative using disinformation. Passenger H may not have gotten the strong winds and high waves memo, as he was quoted in KITV News shortly after the crash, saying that setting foot into the water was not like stepping into a rushing river, but rather like going into a swimming pool, as can be seen in the video frame at lower right, as the camera was pointed straight down onto the water. We know the pilot lied about the catastrophic engine failure and hearing a fire warning horn. We noted the presence of a smoothly running engine in high RPM, absent any metallic noises, knocking, sparks, smoke, or smells that usually accompany an engine said to have failed mechanically and catastrophically, as the teardown in this case certainly showed. How could the pilot have missed that smoothly running engine high RPM sounds were emanating from the compartment just a few feet ahead of him, and said instead that the engine had stopped? Why would he bother to embellish the lie by telling the U.S. Coast Guard commander that he attempted 2 restarts that both failed? Was he trying to prove that he was the perfect high-time pilot who would do everything right? Coincidentally, that's the precise label brought forth about the pilot from the lawyer that twice successfully sued Pratt & Whitney Canada regarding this incident. Not quite 2 years after the crash, one of the passengers, a mystery writer and semi-retired college professor, wrote a breezy recounting of the crash and its aftermath. Therein he notes the fact that no fire accompanied the crash. He wrote that, after later meeting personally with the pilot, befriending him on Facebook, and corresponding with him at least occasionally. Thus, he could have checked any facts about which he was the least bit uncertain. The passenger author and the videographer both attested regarding the plane's altitude at the time of the claimed bang, that it occurred between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. It's curious that they both, using identical wording, would get that fact right when the 18,000-hour ATP pilot was somehow unable to come even close in his 2 differing verbal and written representations to the FAA and NTSB. This summarizes many but not all the false claims made by the plane's pilot and passengers. Any event can have a detail or 2 here or there that gets misremembered, but this event had over 20 major features about which the pilot and passengers not only lied, but the NTSB seemed uniformly unable to recognize those lies as falsehoods, despite having clear evidence in hand to the contrary. In this case, that tells us the pilot, NTSB, and passengers were all in on the deception and hoax. A recovered torn-down engine that showed no evidence of bang or fire would threaten to expose this charade, but what pilot or passengers would ever have agreed to be in a plane whose engine was knowingly going to endure a real catastrophic engine failure and fire? The way to solve that conundrum would be to sabotage the logged engine beforehand, put a throwaway engine on the fuselage for the day of the flight, then fly that throwaway engine onto the water, with a backup plan of landing at either Kalupapa or Honolulu on a perfectly good engine if anything threatening the plan were to occur. The ditched engine could be cut off the plane and dropped into the deep, while the sabotaged logged engine could be dropped into place at the unknown crash site in the open ocean, to be left to pickle for a week, then be fortuitously spotted and dredged up by a salver. 2 engines, the multi-million-dollar Pratt & Whitney Canada lawsuits and their favorable to the plaintiff settlements, costing as a consequence Cessna and Pratt & Whitney customers scores of millions of dollars via airworthiness directives, in part based on results from a sabotaged engine, 3 passengers with serious injuries and the rest with lesser injuries, all means that Pratt & Whitney Canada and Cessna have been framed and their reputations have been irrevocably and indelibly damaged and besmirched, with their stockholders footing the bill. You'll get a whole lot more detail and relevant facts if you pick up the book about the crash that a colleague and I wrote. They're 2.6 pounds by weight, with hundreds of color photos, all in a coffee table format that you can lay flat and examine for hours on end. Electronic copies go for $19.95, with physical copies selling for $39.95. You can also purchase night or day through the website, www.thefuddyhoax.com, at any time. If you have any questions, please leave them below and I'll try to make sure they get answered. Thanks for listening.